Shalom, and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. This is a recording of a Shabbat teaching with Rabbi-Cantor Chorny.
Usually when I teach, I like to start by giving kind of an artful hook, telling a story at the beginning that'll come back around to the end. But I'm afraid if I do that, I might give away the most interesting parts of the shiur. So instead, we're going to start right in the text and then dive deep into two verses in particular. And by the time we get to the end, we may have some time for all of us to do a little bit of reflection about the interesting, at least one interesting idea, maybe two, that should emerge, because I have two big questions. Okay, so starting with the first text here. We're in the book of Vayikra, and we're back to our regularly scheduled programming just this afternoon. And then when's the next time that we read from Shemini? When's the next time? Anyone know? Next Saturday in the morning, when Nathan Shechtman becomes a bar mitzvah upstairs. I don't know what's happening downstairs, something. That's when we're back to Parshat Shemini, because all throughout this week, on the typical Torah reading days and in between, we have the readings for Chol HaMoed and the readings for Chag HaPesach. We have all the special readings. But we come back to Parshat Shemini next Shabbat morning, and we didn't read yet this part this morning because this verse comes right at the end of the second Aliyah. The second Aliyah for full Kriyah, for the full Torah reading, and that's relevant to the teaching this afternoon. Here's the verse. Vatetze eish milifnei Adonai. And a fire went out from before God. Vatochal al hamizbeach. And it consumed the mizbeach. What's the mizbeach? The altar. What happened on the altar typically? The sacrifices took place on the altar. And in this case, it says the fire itself consumed the mizbeach. It consumed the actual altar. You imagine, I know how much woodworking went into this bima, this reader's table. Can you imagine? The whole thing goes up in flames. It doesn't say that. It doesn't say that it tochal al mizbeach. It consumed from the mizbeach. Or maybe it just consumed. Tochal al hamizbeach could also be all. We're supposed to assume that we know that there's a noun in there, and it consumed that which was upon the altar, that which was upon the mizbeach. Well, so there's a little bit of a debate about this, depending on the commentators. The peshat of the verse probably was meant to refer to a noun. The basic meaning of the verse was probably meant to be an absent noun. It consumed that which was upon the altar. But it's read, whatever happened, whatever that fire actually consumed, it was so all-consuming that it produced a completely unusual reaction in the people. What happens? Et ha'olah, the et ha'chalavim. It consumed all of the olah. It consumed all of the fats. So all the sacrifice itself, all of the fats itself. Vayar kol ha'am. And all of the people saw. Vayaronu. How would you translate vayaronu? There are two typical translations. I'm curious what this discerning crowd would say. Vayaronu. What's the verb? Probably rina or reish vav nun or reish nun nun. Those are the two possibilities. It's probably reish vav nun. And we sometimes hear this verb in the Psalms that we read on Friday evenings, yiranenu. And usually when we hear that, it could mean it was a bursting forth, a sort of like a crying out, if you will. And I think that's how. Is that how we have it in the fire? And they shouted. On page 632 in Eitz Chaim, they translated it, and they shouted. But typically, when we talk about rina as a noun, what is rina? Joy or joyful song. So the reaction has at least a connotation of crying out with joy. Al Panehem. What's Al Panehem? Vayipalu. I forgot. I read it in my head. Vayipalu al Panehem. And they fell upon their faces. So what is this reaction that the people are having? potentially one of joy, certainly one of great surprise. Whatever happened, I don't think it was just that the olah and the fats were consumed, because it was shocking. Whatever it was absolutely shocking, and it may have even been a joyful response. What was it that they were responding to, potentially with great joy? What was it that they saw? What do you picture? In your mind, and a great vatetse eish, the great fire came down. What do you picture?
It's a fire that, first of all, they say the fire comes from God. And unlike the other fires which came from the priests, so this is something that's unexpected. Something caught fire, as it were, and was massively consuming.
It was what we might experience even as a lightning strike. It was from God. And from God we mean it was miraculous in its origin. We have no idea, or they had no idea, from whence this great ball of fire, or this great strike of fire came, and therefore their response was either joyful or not, and they fell on their faces. Rosemary, did you have an idea?
Yeah, I was just saying, because they said it burned the fat. When you burn the fat and your fire hits the fat, it does like firework.
That too.
When we do like frying, if the fire hits it, it just goes and makes noises, and it's nice.
So first of all, the fire itself came from God, so it came from a surprising source. And second of all, when it hit the fat and consumed all the fat, it likely did what happens when fire hits fat, and was explosive. Now, here's the most interesting part of that verse in my estimation. Look at page 632. This is chapter 9, verse 24. This is chapter 9, verse 24, which is the beginning of what? What's that the beginning? There's a little marker on the page in Hebrew, and this is at the beginning of something. It's the beginning of the third Aliyah. So as the Jewish people read this story on Shabbat morning next week, and every Shabbat morning in history, when the Jewish people have read according to this subdivision of the Torah portion, they read as follows. Listen carefully. Vatetse eish milifnei Adonai vatochal al hamizbeach. Al hamizbeach et ha'olah ve'et ha'chalavim vayar kol ha'am vayaronu vayiplu al paneihem. And then what's the next verse of the Aliyah? Vayikchu v'nei Aharon Nadav va'avihu ish machtato vayitenu v'hen eish vayasimu aleha ketoret v'yakrivu lifnei Adonai eish zara asher lo tziva otam. Immediately, the second verse of the Aliyah goes into the story of Nadav and Avihu offering eish zara. What is that? Alien fire that is described by the verse as asher lo tziva otam, that was not commanded of them. That was not what they were told to do. And the immediate next verse, vatetse eish milifnei Adonai vatochal otam vayamutu lifnei Adonai. Do you hear the echo of the verse previous? And then a fire came out from before God and consumed otam this time. What does it consume? Nadav and Avihu, and they were taken completely, consumed completely by this fire, and they died. We're told specifically that they died explicitly in the verse, Lifnei Adonai, and that in and of itself is very mysterious. Why is that so strange? Take a look at page 632. Why am I pointing this out? What is odd here? I'm being a little Socratic, but what's strange here? People falling on their faces happens all the time in the Torah, even if we would find it strange now. What's strange about the construction of this? Because it doesn't look, if you were to look at this page and not know Shlishi in the Hebrew, what would you see? Where would the story end?
Then the Aliyah there, and you start the Aliyah with the next.
And why would you think that, Larry? Why would you start the Aliyah with the next verse? Because you see a big...
I'm not sure that it's in the Torah, but you're going to tell me it is. That there's an opening.
There's not. It would tell us here if there were. This is the subdivision that, who made the chapters? Who said this is chapter 10? The Christians. Right? The Jewish tradition never had it, at least for hundreds upon hundreds of years, presumably. Listen, I'm not a scholar. I wrote to one of my biblical scholar buddies back east, but because it wasn't a Pesach question, I didn't get a response fast enough. But my understanding is that at least many, many hundreds of years past, presumably, where the custom was that this was the division of the Torah readings, it certainly never was the case until we received and then took upon ourselves much, much later, the Christian division by chapter of the Torah, that this is a place where we would break the story. That is not where we break the story. In fact, the rabbis are very deliberate about where they assign Shlishi to start. Where does Shlishi start? Yeah, Alan? No, go on. That's okay.
Well, Shlishi does begin talking about the fire and then the death special stuff. But it's not uncommon to have two events linked in. You see Miriam dies, and then there's no water, Miriam dies, the two are connected. Same thing about Sarah dies after she learns of the Akedah. When there are two issues that are next to each other, Chazal have the intention to try and make a point of it. It sounds like that's what we're doing here as well, that there was this particular fire that was going on here, and that's linked to the death of Aviv.
Right. So there are often parallel events that take place, some of which have verses that sound so similarly parallel, just as in this case, that it makes sense that we link them in the way that we divide the storytelling. Remember that this was an oral art, right? The storytelling at the Torah. And so the idea that just one verse apart, one from another, we have fire that comes out from before God, at which the people rejoiced and fell on their faces. And 2 verses later, fire is coming out from before God and consuming the sons of Aaron, and that their sort of that their death, their great and mysterious death, and their death in light of rebellion, those things are not just inextricably linked; they have to be even more closely linked in the rabbinic mind than would appear on the surface. So we're going to look at how the rabbis treat this. Okay, do you have a thought?
I have a question out of this subject. How come in this Vayisha 8, when you read that, it has I don't know, in the tropes that I read, it's like joyous song. And I think like it's amazing because there are 2 people dying and the song is, the melody is joyous.
I will give you a brief answer. I'm going to echo your question and give you a brief answer. So Rosemary asks, why is it that it sounds when the 2 sons die as if it's joyful trope? Because in one of the 32 Ashkenazi systems that we've received for chanting from the Torah, what it sounds like is V'tetzei eish milifnei Adonai v'tochal otam v'yamutu lifnei Adonai. We, with our Western ears, post the classical music era, hear those major tropes, and we think of that as being uplifting or happy. It sounds not in line or in tune with what's taking place. But there are 2 reasons for that. One is because of the modernity, the nature of how we hear major music. In fact, I was just listening to a scholar of classical music saying that Gen Alpha, when tested in laboratory settings, actually associates happiness with minor keys to a degree more than 300% higher than previous generations. It's entirely an acculturated ear-related thing. And the second is that if we were reading this in trope that from Bulgaria or trope from the Taimani community or Moroccans, it might not sound joyous at all. So it's utterly happenstance. It's both the way that we hear certain music, and it's also the way that those that we happen to be chanting these particular ta'amim in other communities. Even right here in Los Angeles, it might not sound so uplifting even to our ears. So it's just happenstance, but it's a great question. Okay, so now we're going to figure out what the rabbis thought was so remarkably interlinked between this first Teitzei Eish verse and the second one. Rashbam has something to say about this. Who's Rashbam? He's got a famous grandfather. Rashi, okay. So Rashbam comes out. Rashbam often disagrees with Rashi. I didn't bother to bring the Rashi on this one because of time. Mi Beit Kodesh HaKodeshim, derech mizbach hazahav lehaktir ketoret, shehu kodem lehaktarat tamid. V'sham matzah b'nei Aharon etzel mizbach hazahav usrafam, v'char kach yatsa uvad lo al hamizbeach. So this fire, says Rashbam, it came from I was just teaching about this morning, the Kodesh HaKodeshim, the innermost, the devir, the innermost part of the Mishkan. It traveled past the golden altar, he says. Is that in our Torah, or is he just saying that at this point? Do we have that? That it traveled past the golden altar, where it burnt up that incense? We're firmly in Midrash now, right? He's telling a story. It went past the golden altar, where it burnt up the incense, which was always offered before the daily sacrifice. And then once it was there at that golden altar, that Aish found the sons of Aharon and consumed them. Then the fire moved to the altar in the courtyard of the Mishkan. What is Rashbam saying about this fire and these two verses?
Well, if you're saying it's coming from Kodesh Kodashim, the only time you enter Kodesh Kodashim is the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur. So it could not have been a humanly started fire.
So the first thing he wants to establish is it's definitely not established by humans, because he says it emanated from the Kodesh Kodashim, or perhaps he's explaining they knew it came from God because it came out of the Kodesh Kodashim, and that is only ever entered on Yom Kippur by the high priest, and therefore that's where it came out from. Sure. You know what else I think he's saying? Unless I'm misreading Rashbam, and you can tell me you read it differently. I think he's saying, you don't understand. One fire came out in this moment. What happened? It consumed everything on the altar, and it also consumed the sons of Aaron. It's not that fire went out and consumed the Mishkan, and then another fire came out and consumed the sons. It's one bit of fire, and it did two things. And that one bit of fire, when it consumed the Mizbeach, how did the people react? They rejoiced. And then the sons died. And we hear about Aharon's reaction. And how does he react? Silence. Okay, hold that thought. Go to the Sifra, which, sorry, it's going a little bit back in time. But the Sifra is coming in to support my read of the verse that the people were reacting with great joy. When they saw this new kind of fire, that came down from the heavenly heavens. I think they have a different picture. The Sifra, the Rashbam, who comes many generations later, pictures it coming out of the Kodesh Kodashim. They picture it coming from the Shemayim, from the Marom. What did they do? They opened their mouths and they said a poem, a song. They recited joyfully. In that moment, when they saw that it consumed the altar, this new fire, they were so excited about it. But of course, that's not at all how we would react if the only thing that had happened was that the sons had been consumed. So one fire comes out from the heavens, from the Kodesh HaKodeshim, from God, from the upper echelons, from the Marom, and comes and it does two things. It first does this wondrous, incredible thing where it consumes the whole, like a magical affair. It consumes the whole, everything that's on the altar in a way that they had not experienced before. And they're so excited. And then it consumes the sons. All the same event, doing multiple things, achieving multiple things at opposite ends of the spectrum. Absolute miraculous wondrousness, perhaps the likes of which they had not seen since God saved them from Egypt. And the most horrific thing that could be imagined, the sons of the priest Aharon being killed for having done something ostensibly in the course of their service that they were commanded to do, though they went off course. This notion is both a wild one and also a very humane one. I want to take a turn from the wondrousness of the Torah to the idea of the reactions that we have to events before we know the entire course of consequences that will play out from a particular event. Something enormous happens, and we rejoice at that thing happening, but we don't know yet if later the consequences of that very same enormous event might lead to something horrific. And vice versa, something that seems horrendous from the start, something that's an unimaginable act, even what we call today an act of God still, could then later seemingly, because we're ascribing our stories to the thing, we're making connections all the time, seemingly that same event could then yield something wonderful. I want to look at a story from the Talmud that contends with this idea, but Marshall's going to say something first.
To me, that what you mentioned just now, the juxtaposition of the age which consumed everything, and also the sons, and an echo for me of Shirat Hayam. The Jews were saved when the splitting of the sea, and immediately following that is death, drowning of the Egyptians.
Okay, so Marshall's bringing up the fact that when we read Shirat Hayam, that we first have this joyfulness of the Jewish people being able to go through the miraculously dry, split sea. And then, of course, all the drowning of the Egyptians and its death and presumably chaos and just a terrible outcome for the Egyptian universe. But because it's not our natural state to be so concerned with the fate of our enemies, we have midrashim going back thousands of years that have to chastise us should we think that we don't have to worry about that, right? Lest we think we not worry about that, we have midrashim with the angels, with God chastising the angels for having rejoiced as the sea closed up, right? And to this day, what do we do at our Seder tables to ensure that we don't accidentally rejoice at the suffering of others? Close. It is dipping. It's the dipping of our finger in the wine or the grape juice because we're diminishing our experience of joy. Now, hold that thought. I must say, I'm not entirely sure after having read Vanessa Oakes' book on the Haggadah that that's at all what the original purpose was of having dipping out the wine. I think that's maybe a later ascribe. That's for another shiur, another time. But a lot of the things that we do at the Seder table, we ascribe meaning to them from whatever we know most, like furthest back in history is the meaning that's attached to that. Let's look at the story from Brachot, and then we'll get to more thoughts and questions and answers. But you're absolutely right, Marshall, to make connections with this idea that certain events both yield miraculous wondrousness and joyful outcomes and also great destruction. Okay, so a story from Brachot. We're going to read it in English because it's such a good story, unless you really want me to read the Aramaic. Should I read it in Aramaic? It's not, you know what? I'm going to read a little in Aramaic because you're going to hear some interesting echoes. So here we go. Ki had Rabbi Akiva. You already know who's the main character of the story. Rabbi Akiva. Well, we'll find out if he's the main story or if he's telling a story about someone else. Dehava ka'azel be'orcha. Mitava hahimata. Ba'a ushpiza la yahavile. Amar. Ki de'aved rachmana. Litav. Azal uvat bidavra. Vahava bahade tarnagola. Vachamara ushraga. Ata zika kavye lishraga. Ata shunra ache litornagola. Does it sound a little bit like a poem we just read at the Seder table? Shunra ache litarnagola. That's not how that goes, but you get it. Ata arya ache lachamara. Amar. Kol de'avid rachamana litav. Bei belelai. Ata geyasa. Shavya lemata. Amar lehu. Lav amari lechu. Kol masha osa hakadosh baruch hu. Sorry that it cut off here, but it says hakol letova, which is only interesting because we switch over to Hebrew from Aramaic. But the punchline is hakol letova, which means what? Hakol letova? It's all for good. Here's the story. Gemara says one time Rabbi Akiva was walking along the road. He gets to a city. He asks about lodging for the night. They will not give him lodging. He says everything that the Rachmana, everyone that God does, he does it for the best. So he goes and he sleeps in the field. And what does he have with him? A rooster, a donkey, and a candle. And then some terrible things happened, it would seem. A gust of wind came and extinguished the candle. A cat came and ate the rooster. A lion came and ate the donkey. What did Rabbi Akiva say? Everything that God does, he does for the best. That night, an army came into that city and took the city into captivity. And so what did Rabbi Akiva say to them? Didn't I tell you? Everything that God does for good. And the added commentary says, it turned out that Rabbi Akiva alone, who was not in the city and had no lit candle, no noisy rooster or donkey to give away his location, was saved. The Gemara goes on to say something fascinating that would seemingly be disconnected, but I am convinced is deeply connected and ties back into the story of Aharon and his sons. The very next line in the Talmud is as follows. V'amar Rav Huna, Amar Rav Mishum Rabbi Meir. So a teaching that was passed down Rabbi Meir through his students. Le'olam yihiyu devarav shel Adam mu'atin lifnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu. A human being should always say very little before God. Blessed be God. Why? Shne'emar al tevahel al picha v'libecha al yimaher lehotzi davar lifnei ha'elohim ki ha'elohim b'shamayim ve'ata al ha'aretz al ken yihiyu devarecha me'atim. This quote from Kohelet, don't be rash with your mouth, don't let your heart be quick to utter a word before God, because God is in heaven and you on earth, let your words be few. Here is what I am convinced. This is the real drop punchline of this teaching. I am convinced that Aharon was among the people who rejoiced when that fire came out from the Kodesh HaKodeshim or from the heavens. Wow, look at that fire. What a miracle. God is amazing. And then in the next moment, that same fire consumed his sons. I'm convinced that's the simple meaning of the story. You don't have to be convinced of that. But I think that what the Talmud is saying is, without knowledge of the great plans of God on high in the universe, we're so quick to call something that is amazing, something that very obviously has destructive force and power. We're so quick to call it a miracle when it seems miraculous before us. But the Talmud warns us, don't be so quick. The thing that seems so miraculous in this moment, if it's explosive, if it has the power to be destructive too, you don't know yet. You don't know what the end of the story is. And it really goes both ways. Because the story in our Torah, of course, goes in the direction of great sadness, to the point of a father who could not speak because his sons were taken in that horrific and wondrous event. But in the story from Rabbi Akiva, we learn that it can be quite the opposite. Why should we stand in a field when a lion eats our donkey and the cat eats the rooster and go, my God, why do you hate me so much, God? Right? To curse the Holy One, to say so much because we're so convinced such a terrible thing, when that night perhaps it could have saved us. Be humble, says the text. Be humble when you see an event before you and look to see if maybe the outcome isn't sure yet or clear yet. Maybe there's another outcome to come. And maybe the story isn't over yet.
You've been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast website or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information on Temple Beth Am, Los Angeles, please visit www.tba.la.org.